The mountain man they called Devil Jim sat behind iron bars like a caged grizzly, and everyone in Silverton knew he'd killed 3 men with his bare hands. That's what Sarah Beth Coleman heard when she stepped off the evening stage with nothing but a carpetbag and desperation thick as winter fog. The stage driver spat tobacco juice into the snow. That mountain man they got locked up, Devil Jim McKenna. Killed 3 men with his bare hands, they say. Stay clear of that jail, miss. But Sarah had nowhere else to go. No money for the boarding house, no family to wire, no prospects except the brutal man she'd fled from back in Missouri. She approached the log jail with trembling steps, her grandmother's wedding ring hanging cold against her chest on its thin chain. Through the bars, she saw him. Weathered face, gentle eyes, reading a worn Bible by lamplight. Nothing like the monster they'd described. Jim McKenna looked up from his reading, studied her face with quiet intelligence. "You lost, ma'am. This ain't no place for a lady." Sarah's voice shook like autumn leaves. "Please, I need help. Will you marry me?" Jim set down his Bible slowly, never taking his eyes from hers. "Ma'am, I reckon you better tell me what kind of trouble's chasing you." From the mountain trail came the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. The hoofbeats faded into the night wind, but Sarah's hands still trembled as she gripped the jail bars. Jim McKenna shifted on his narrow cot, making room for her to sit on the wooden stool someone had left outside his cell. "Start from the beginning," he said, breaking his meager evening meal in half and offering her the larger portion through the bars. A woman doesn't travel alone to a place like Silverton unless she's running from something worse. Sarah accepted the hard bread and thin soup with grateful hands. When was the last time someone had shown her simple kindness? "My father owed money to a man named Pete Morrison back in Missouri. Gentleman Pete, they called him. When Pa died, Pete said I could work off the debt by marrying him." Jim's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. "Sounds like you jumped from the frying pan into the fire coming here. Pete Morrison owns everything in our county now. The sheriff, the judge, even the preacher. He told me I was his property, fair and square." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "He showed me what happened to the last woman who tried to run." Heavy boots echoed on the wooden planks outside. Marshal Wade Briggs filled the doorway, his badge catching the lamplight. "Miss Coleman, I presume? Folks saw you talking to the prisoner. Best you move along now." "What's he charged with, Marshal?" Sarah asked, standing her ground. "Murder. 3 claim jumpers up at Pine Ridge. Killed 'em in cold blood over a mining dispute." Briggs looked at Jim with undisguised hatred. "Devil Jim here's got a trial coming up. Guilty verdict's already a foregone conclusion." After Briggs left, Sarah studied Jim's face. The marshal's words didn't match what she saw. This man had calloused hands from honest work, not violence. She'd learned to read faces living with her father's drinking and Pete's threats. At Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, the landlady served weak coffee and strong opinions. That Jim McKenna's been nothing but trouble since he came to town 2 years back. Keeps to himself up in those mountains, working his claim. Then one night, 3 men turn up dead, and there's Jim standing over them with blood on his hands. "Did anyone see what happened?" Sarah asked. Mrs. O'Malley lowered her voice. "Doc Henley was there, but he was drunk as a lord. Can't trust nothing he says." She leaned closer. "Though I will say, Jim never struck me as the killing type. Always tipped his hat polite-like when he came to town for supplies." Outside the saloon, Doc Henley stumbled past, muttering to his bottle. Sarah caught only fragments. "Devil Jim! Ha! Only devil in this town wears a badge." The words stuck with her as she made her way back to the jail. Something wasn't right about Jim McKenna's story. In a town full of liars, he might be the only honest man left. "I still need that marriage, Mr. McKenna," she said through the bars. Jim studied her face in the lamplight, seeing something that made him nod slowly. "Then I reckon we best do this proper." From his office window, Marshal Briggs watched them with eyes dark as winter storm clouds. Dawn broke gray and cold over Silverton, but inside the jail something sacred was taking shape. Doc Henley arrived surprisingly sober, carrying a small book of territorial law and walking steadier than anyone had seen in months. You sure about this, Jim? Doc asked, settling onto the stool beside Sarah. Marriage is a mighty serious business. More serious than a noose? Jim replied, straightening his worn shirt as best he could. Besides, the lady asked proper. Man be a fool to refuse. Sarah pulled her grandmother's wedding ring from the chain around her neck. The simple gold band caught the morning light streaming through the jail window. Grandmama wore this for 47 years. Said it brought her luck. Then it's blessed already, Jim said softly. Doc cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice, usually slurred with whiskey, rang clear and strong. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here. The words felt strange in the rough log jail, but they carried weight. Sacred promises spoken in a profane place somehow seemed more precious, not less. Do you, James McKenna, take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? Jim looked directly into Sarah's eyes. I do. Do you, Sarah Beth Coleman, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? Sarah slipped the ring onto her own finger, her grandmother's blessing settling around her heart. I do. The jail door burst open before Doc could pronounce them man and wife. Marshal Briggs stormed in, face red with anger. This is illegal. She can't marry a condemned man. Check your law books, Marshal, Jim said calmly. I ain't been convicted of nothing yet. A man's got the right to marry up until the moment they put the rope around his neck. Doc held up the territorial law book. He's right, Wade. The ceremony's legal and binding. To everyone's surprise, Mrs. O'Malley appeared in the doorway, carrying a pot of coffee and wearing her Sunday dress. Let them be, Wade Briggs. Ain't no law against two souls finding comfort in each other. She set the coffee pot down with authority. Besides, I figured they might want some decent refreshment for their wedding breakfast. As the morning sun climbed higher, young Tommy burst through the door, his face flushed from running. The boy served as unofficial messenger for his father, the night guard, and his eyes were wide with alarm. Mrs. McKenna, he gasped, using Sarah's new name for the first time. 3 riders just came through town asking about you at the boarding house. One of them had papers, official-looking papers. Sarah's face went white as fresh snow. Through the jail window, she could see dust still settling on the main street. He found me, she whispered. The next few hours passed like a fever dream. Sarah sat as close to Jim's cell as the bars would allow, drawing comfort from his steady presence while her mind raced with fear. Jim, for his part, seemed more concerned about her safety than his own upcoming trial. Tell me about these mountains, Sarah said, needing distraction from her racing thoughts. You know them well? Well as any man can know country that wild, Jim replied. Spent 2 years learning every trail, every stream, every cave big enough to shelter in. Winter up here don't forgive mistakes. You sound like a teacher yourself. Was a cavalry scout before I came here. Army teaches you to read land, like other folks read books. He paused, studying her face. What about you? You got learning beyond most women. Sarah managed a small smile. Taught school back in Missouri before everything went wrong. Children are honest. You always know where you stand with them. As the afternoon wore on, they shared pieces of their lives like breaking bread. Jim told her about his years in the cavalry, the battles fought and friends lost. Sarah spoke of her students, her father's slow decline into drink and debt, the growing shadow of Pete Morrison's control over their town. Lost my first family to cholera during the war, Jim said quietly as evening approached. Wife and 2 little ones. Thought maybe God was punishing me for surviving when so many good men didn't. Sarah reached through the bars to touch his hand. Maybe God kept you alive for something important. Maybe for right now. She tended the infected wounds on his wrists, where the shackles had rubbed raw, cleaning them with water warmed over the small stove and strips of cloth torn from her spare chemise. Her touch was gentle but sure, a teacher's hands accustomed to caring for others. You're handy with doctoring, Jim observed. Had to be. Pa cut himself regular when the shakes got bad. Pete Morrison. She didn't finish, but Jim saw the shadow cross her face. Did he hurt you? Not yet, but he made it clear what kind of marriage he expected. She met Jim's eyes steadily. That's not what marriage should be, is it? Fear and ownership? No, ma'am, should be partnership. Two people choosing to face the world together. Young Tommy appeared again as full darkness settled over Silverton. This time he looked around nervously before approaching the jail. Mr. Jim, he whispered. Pa told me not to say nothing, but you ain't really killed nobody, did you? Jim and Sarah exchanged glances. What makes you ask that, son? Pa said you were in jail because you threatened to tell the territorial marshal about something. Said you caught someone taking money they shouldn't. Tommy's young face was earnest in the lamplight. Pa said the story about you killing them miners was made up to make folks afraid of believing you. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place like a puzzle box opening. What did Jim threaten to tell about? Pa heard Marshal Briggs taking money from mining folks, selling claims that weren't his to sell, keeping the law away from certain places where bad things happened. Jim's voice was quiet steel. Your pa's a good man, Tommy. Dangerous thing, being honest in a dishonest place. The boy nodded solemnly. Pa says the truth's like water. Always finds a way to the surface, even if it takes time. Footsteps approached outside. Tommy scurried away as Marshal Briggs appeared, his face hard with satisfaction. Well, well, enjoying your last night of wedded bliss? He smiled coldly. Judge arrived this afternoon. Your trial's been moved up, Devil Jim. Tomorrow morning, first light. Jim gripped the bars, his knuckles white. That's mighty sudden, Marshal. Justice delayed is justice denied, Briggs replied. Course, if your new wife wants to say goodbye proper-like, I might be willing to arrange some privacy, for the right consideration. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah stood up, her voice steady despite her fear. My husband and I will manage just fine without your help, Marshal. After Briggs left, Sarah reached through the bars to take Jim's hand. Tomorrow, when this trial happens, what chance do you have? Against a bought judge and paid witnesses? Jim shook his head. About as much chance as a snowball in hell. Then we need to make our own chances. Jim looked at her with growing admiration. You got something in mind, Mrs. McKenna? Before she could answer, the jail door opened one more time. But this visitor was different, and his presence would change everything. The makeshift courtroom filled with townspeople drawn by curiosity and bloodlust. Judge Harrison, a thin man with cold eyes, had arrived on the morning stage with an air of someone completing distasteful but necessary business. Sarah sat in the front row, watching her husband face a mockery of justice. The prosecution called its witnesses, 3 men who claimed to have seen Jim standing over the bodies at Pine Ridge, blood on his hands and murder in his eyes. Their stories matched too perfectly, like a play rehearsed until every line was smooth. Jim's defense lasted exactly 7 minutes. No witnesses called on his behalf, no evidence presented in his favor. When Jim tried to speak about what he'd really seen that night, Judge Harrison cut him off. The defendant will remain silent unless asked a direct question, the judge declared. This court has heard enough testimony to render judgment. Sarah felt rage building in her chest like steam in a boiler. These men were murdering her husband with gavels and false testimony, and everyone in town was watching it happen. As the crowd dispersed for the midday recess, Sarah slipped out to begin her own investigation. At the courthouse, she found the records office and began searching through mining claims and property transfers. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Jim's mining claim, the richest strike in the territory according to the assay reports, had been quietly transferred to a holding company just last month. The papers bore Marshal Briggs' signature as a witness, but Jim's name was notably absent from the transaction. Looking for something specific, miss? Sarah turned to find a well-dressed man watching her from the doorway. Expensive clothes, soft hands, cold smile. Even before he spoke again, she knew who he was. Mrs. McKenna now, actually, she said, standing straighter. And you must be Gentleman Pete Morrison. His smile widened like a snake unhinging its jaw. Sarah Beth, you've led me quite a chase, darling, but it's time to come home. I am home. Pete pulled a folded document from his coat. Your father's signature on our marriage contract says otherwise. You belong to me, legally and proper. I've come to collect what's mine. Through the courthouse window, Sarah could see townspeople gathering for the afternoon session. Some looked troubled by the morning's proceedings, but others seemed eager to see blood spilled in the name of justice. I'm married now, Sarah said, backing toward the door. That contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. We'll see about that. I've brought federal papers and a territorial marshal's authority to collect you. Pete's voice turned silky with threat. Of course, once your husband swings tomorrow, you'll be a widow anyway. Save us all some trouble. Sarah ran back to the jail, her heart pounding. Jim listened to her report with growing concern, not for himself, but for her safety. He can't just take you, Jim said. Marriage laws in Colorado Territory supersede Missouri contracts. Can he? Not if there's honest law left in this territory. Jim's voice carried little hope. But honest law's been in short supply around here lately. Mrs. O'Malley appeared at the jail door with a pot of stew and a determined expression. Heard about your visitor, she said to Sarah. That Pete Morrison's been spreading money around town like seed corn, buying friends and paying for cooperation. Will anyone stand up to him? Some will. Question is whether it'll be enough. Mrs. O'Malley set down the stew pot. Town's been bleeding good people for 2 years now. Folks too scared to speak up, too comfortable to rock the boat. Young Tommy slipped in after her, looking nervous. Pa wants you to know, he whispered to Jim. Doc Henley's been asking questions, sober questions. About what really happened that night at Pine Ridge. Doc's in danger, Jim said immediately. If he starts talking, Pa knows. He's keeping an eye on him. As afternoon faded to evening, the courthouse emptied and the town held its breath. Tomorrow would bring Jim's verdict, but tonight brought a different kind of trial. Sarah sat beside Jim's cell, watching shadows lengthen across the floor. I won't let him take you, Jim said quietly. How can you stop him from in there? I'll find a way. Sarah reached through the bars to touch his face. Jim McKenna, you're about the most stubborn man I ever met. Good thing, considering what we're up against. Footsteps approached the jail, but these weren't the measured steps of Marshal Briggs or the confident stride of Pete Morrison. These were the stumbling, uneven steps of a man barely staying upright. Doc Henley appeared in the doorway, blood soaking his shirt and desperation in his eyes. They tried to shut me up permanent, he gasped, collapsing against the doorframe. But I got something to tell. Doc Henley slumped against the jail wall, pressing a bloodied cloth to his head. His usual alcoholic haze had been beaten away, leaving sharp intelligence in eyes that had seen too much. They jumped me outside the saloon, he wheezed. 3 of Morrison's men said I'd been asking too many questions about Pine Ridge. Sarah knelt beside him, examining his wounds with a teacher's practical concern. You need proper doctoring. I am the doctor in this town, such as it is. Doc managed a weak smile. Just patch me up enough to talk. Got things to say while I still can. Jim gripped the cell bars. Doc, what did you see that night? More than I let on. More than was safe to remember. Doc accepted the water Sarah brought him, his hands steadying as he drank. I saw Marshal Briggs kill that territorial inspector. Shot him down when the man started asking about missing mining claims. The words hung in the jail like smoke from a discharged rifle. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle sliding together with terrible clarity. The 3 dead men at Pine Ridge, she said. They weren't claim jumpers. They were witnesses. Government men, Doc confirmed. Come to investigate reports of corruption. Briggs couldn't let them report back to the territorial capital. And Jim? Jim tried to stop it. Fought like hell, but there were too many of them. When it was over, Briggs had his story all worked out. Devil Jim the killer, standing over the bodies with blood on his hands. Doc's voice strengthened as the truth poured out of him. Been drinking myself stupid for 2 years, trying to forget what I saw. But a man can only run from the truth so long. Outside, the town settled into evening routines, unaware that the foundation of their accepted reality was crumbling inside the log jail. Sarah felt Pete Morrison's presence like a weight pressing down on the whole settlement. There's more, Doc continued. Morrison ain't just your problem, Mrs. McKenna. He's Briggs' business partner in the whole operation. Your arranged marriage was meant to legitimize their land grab back in Missouri. Sarah's grandmother's ring felt heavy on her finger. My father's farm sits on mineral rights worth more than this whole town. Morrison needed a wife with legal claim to the property. Doc's laugh held no humor. Weren't never about you being his property. Was about him getting his hands on your inheritance. Jim's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. How many others, Doc? How many good people they killed or driven off? Too many to count. Anyone who asked questions or stood in their way just disappeared, like they never existed. A new sound reached their ears, the measured beat of horses approaching at a steady pace. Not the hurried hoofbeats of messengers or the casual clip-clop of evening travelers. This was the sound of men with purpose, riding in formation. Tommy appeared at the jail door, his young face pale with fear. Pa sent me to warn you. Morrison's brought men with him, says they're federal marshals, but Pa don't think so. They got the look of hired guns. How many? Jim asked. 6, maybe 7. All armed, all mean-looking. Sarah stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on a winter pond. Then we don't have much time. Time for what? Doc asked. To get the truth to someone who can do something about it. Jim studied her face in the lamplight. Sarah, what are you thinking? I'm thinking a man shouldn't hang for trying to stop murder. I'm thinking a town shouldn't have to live under corrupt law. And I'm thinking Gentleman Pete Morrison has underestimated the woman he tried to buy. Doc reached into his coat with shaking hands, pulling out a folded paper. Been writing down everything I remember. Names, dates, what I saw that night. Testimony of Dr. Henry Henley, sworn before God and witnessed by my own conscience. Will it hold up in court? Against an honest judge? Might could. Doc's voice hardened. But we'd need to get it to the territorial capital, and Morrison's men will be watching every road. The sound of horses grew closer, accompanied now by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of spurs. Sarah moved to the window, peering through the darkness. They're surrounding the jail, she reported. Jim tested the strength of his cell door, knowing it was futile but needing to try. Doc, can you get that testimony out of town? In my condition? I'd be lucky to make it to the church without falling down. Then we need another plan. Sarah turned from the window, her face set with determination. We need to break you out of here, Jim McKenna. Tonight. Sarah, that's the only way any of us survive this. Her voice carried the authority of a schoolteacher who'd made up her mind. They mean to kill you whether you're guilty or innocent. The only difference is whether they do it legal-like or in some back alley. Heavy boots approached the jail door. Time was running out, but hope flickered like a candle flame in a strong wind. Mrs. McKenna, came Pete Morrison's voice from outside, smooth as aged whiskey. Time for you and me to have a proper conversation. Pete Morrison filled the jail doorway like a storm cloud, flanked by 2 men whose badges looked newer than their gun belts. Behind them, Sarah could see more figures moving in the darkness, positioning themselves around the building. Hello, Sarah Beth, Pete said, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, darling. Mrs. McKenna, Sarah corrected, standing between Pete and Jim's cell. And you're trespassing. Pete's laugh was soft and dangerous. Trespassing? I've got federal authority to collect stolen property. He held up a document bearing official seals. Your marriage to this murderer is invalid. You were already promised to me. Doc Henley struggled to his feet, swaying but determined. That marriage was performed legal and proper. I did it myself. Ah, the town drunk. Your testimony should carry considerable weight. Pete's smile never wavered. Though I hear you've been having accidents lately, drinking can be dangerous to a man's health. Jim's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Say your piece and get out, Morrison. The lady's made her choice. The lady doesn't have a choice. She's coming with me tonight, along with the legal documents establishing my claim to her father's property. Pete's facade of gentility began to crack. The only question is whether this ends easy or hard. And if I refuse? Then your husband dies tonight instead of waiting for tomorrow's hanging. My associates here have come to collect a dangerous fugitive who was attempting to escape. Pete gestured to his fake marshals. Regrettable, but these mountain criminals can be unpredictable. Sarah felt the trap closing around them, but her mind raced ahead, looking for the escape routes that must exist. Every problem had a solution. Her father had taught her that before the drinking took him. I need a moment to gather my things, she said carefully. Of course, you have 5 minutes. As Pete and his men stepped outside to give her privacy, Sarah moved quickly. Doc's written confession went into her coat pocket. Jim's Bible went into her carpet bag, along with the few possessions that mattered. What are you doing? Jim whispered. Buying us time. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Doc, is there a back way out of this building? Root cellar connects to the old mine shaft, comes up behind the church. Can Jim fit through? If he's motivated enough. Sarah reached through the bars, taking Jim's face in her hands. When I go with Pete, you run. Get to the territorial capital with Doc's testimony. Clear your name and come back for me. Sarah, I can't let you. You can and you will. This isn't over, Jim McKenna. Not by a long shot. The jail door opened again, admitting not just Pete but Marshal Briggs, whose face was dark with barely controlled rage. Situation's more complicated than we thought, Briggs muttered to Pete. Doc's been talking to people. Tommy's father is asking questions. Some of the townspeople are getting restless. Then we clean up all the loose ends tonight. Pete's voice had lost any pretense of civility, starting with the drunk. Doc Henley straightened, meeting Pete's gaze with clear eyes. I ain't as drunk as I used to be, and I ain't as scared as I used to be either. Doc, Pete said softly, you're about to have a very serious accident. What happened next changed everything. Doc reached into his coat as if going for a weapon. Pete's men drew their guns, ready to shoot down an unarmed drunk. But instead of a gun, Doc pulled out a second copy of his written confession. Already sent one to the territorial marshal in Denver, he said with a steady voice. This here's just my insurance policy. The lie was perfect, delivered with the conviction of a man who'd finally found his courage. Pete's face went white, then red with rage. You're lying. Maybe not. Question is, can you afford to find out? In the moment of confusion that followed, several things happened at once. Tommy's father appeared with a shotgun, backing up the doctor. Mrs. O'Malley arrived with 3 other townswomen, all carrying lanterns and grim determination. And through the back window of the jail, Sarah glimpsed movement that might have been salvation or might have been more trouble. Looks like your easy night just got complicated, Morrison, Jim said from his cell. Pete's civilized mask finally slipped completely. Kill them all. We'll sort out the stories later. But before anyone could draw a weapon, a new voice cut through the tension like a cavalry bugle. That'll be enough. Through the jail door stepped a man wearing a real federal badge, followed by 6 actual U.S. Marshals. The territorial authority Pete had been impersonating had arrived to investigate reports of corruption in Silverton. In the chaos that followed, Sarah saw her chance. While Pete's men were surrendering their weapons and protesting their innocence, she slipped Jim's cell key from Marshal Briggs's distracted guard. Time to go, husband, she whispered through the bars. But their escape was far from over. Pete Morrison might be facing federal charges, but he still had men in the mountains and resources to continue the fight. The real battle was just beginning. As Jim stepped out of his cell, a free man for the first time in months, Sarah took his hand and led him toward the back of the jail where Doc had mentioned the root cellar. Where are we going? Jim asked. Somewhere we can figure out our next move. Sarah's voice was steady, despite everything they'd been through. Pete Morrison might be caught, but this isn't finished. Not until we've made sure the truth comes out and justice gets served. Behind them, they could hear Pete's voice rising in protest as the federal marshals placed him under arrest. But Sarah knew her husband was right. This was far from over. The root cellar led to an abandoned mine shaft that emerged behind the church, just as Doc had promised. Jim and Sarah crept through the darkness, listening to the sounds of confusion and arrest echoing from the jail behind them. Where now? Sarah whispered as they reached the surface. My cabin. It's defensible, and I've got supplies cached there. Jim took her hand, leading her toward the mountain trail. But it's a hard climb in the dark. They were halfway up the steep path when they heard it, the sound of pursuit. Not the organized march of federal marshals, but the hurried hoofbeats of desperate men. Pete Morrison might be in custody, but some of his hired guns had escaped the net. How many? Sarah asked, pressing against a large boulder as the sounds grew closer. 4, maybe 5, enough to cause trouble. They climbed higher, using Jim's knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of their pursuers. When they finally reached the cabin, smoke was rising from the chimney and lamplight glowed in the windows. Jim drew his gun, motioning Sarah to stay behind him. Someone's already here. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a grizzled man in cavalry boots and a weather-beaten hat. He grinned at Jim's surprised expression. "About time you showed up, McKenna. Coffee's getting cold." "Sergeant Bill Hawkins," Jim said with relief. "What in hell are you doing here?" "Got word from some mutual friends that you might need backup. Rode hard from Fort Collins when I heard about your situation." Bill's eyes found Sarah. "Ma'am, heard you married yourself a good man." Inside the cabin, Bill brought them up to date. "Real territorial marshal's name is Henderson. Been investigating corruption reports for months. Your Doc Henley's testimony was just what he needed to make arrests." "Then it's over?" Sarah asked. "The legal part, maybe. But Morrison had more men than just the ones in town. Some of them are still loyal to his money, if not to him." Bill poured coffee with steady hands. "They'll be coming up this mountain tonight, looking to settle scores." As if to prove his point, the distant crack of rifle fire echoed from below. Their pursuers had found the cabin. "How long can we hold them off?" Jim asked, checking his weapons. "Depends on how determined they are and how much ammunition we have." Sarah moved to the window, peering down the mountain slope. Muzzle flashes dotted the darkness like deadly fireflies. "There are more of them than we thought." The siege began in earnest as the hired guns surrounded the cabin. Jim, Sarah, and Bill took positions at different windows, returning fire when targets presented themselves. The attackers had the advantage of numbers, but the defenders had the high ground and better cover. "They're trying to work around behind us," Bill observed during a lull in the shooting. "There's a back trail," Jim said. "Steep and dangerous, but it leads to the old mine entrance. I'll cover it. You two keep them busy from the front." As Bill disappeared into the darkness, Sarah found herself loading rifles and passing ammunition with steady hands. Fear had burned away in the crucible of action, leaving only determination. "Never figured I'd spend my honeymoon in a gunfight," she said, surprising herself by almost smiling. "Never figured I'd have someone worth fighting for again," Jim replied, squeezing off a careful shot at a shadow moving between trees. The battle raged through the night. Their attackers were persistent, but not particularly skilled, more accustomed to intimidating unarmed townspeople than fighting determined defenders in strong positions. Near dawn, during a quiet moment when even the hired guns seemed to need rest, Jim sat beside Sarah by the fireplace. "And the cabin walls were scarred by bullet holes, but they'd held." "Sarah," Jim said softly, "I need to tend that cut on your arm." She looked down, surprised to see blood on her sleeve where a splinter had grazed her. Jim's hands were gentle as he cleaned and bandaged the wound by firelight. "Never thought I'd have someone to fight for again," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat strong and steady. "And I never thought I'd find a man worth standing beside, no matter what came." Through the cabin window, the first pale light of dawn revealed their situation. The hired guns were still out there, but they looked tired and discouraged. Morning would bring decisions, whether to continue the siege or cut their losses and run. It also brought an unexpected sound, the distant notes of a cavalry bugle echoing from the valley below. "Bill?" Sarah asked. Jim listened carefully, then smiled for the first time in hours. "No, ma'am. That's the real thing. Sounds like Sergeant Hawkins had more friends coming than he let on." The siege of the mountain cabin was about to become a very different kind of battle. The cavalry bugle sounded again, closer now and accompanied by the thunder of hoofbeats on mountain stone. Through the morning mist, Sarah could see blue uniforms and federal badges moving up the trail in organized formation. U.S. Marshal Henderson, came a voice amplified by a speaking trumpet. You men are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender. The hired guns scattered like quail, abandoning their siege as federal authority arrived in force. Some tried to escape up the mountain trails, but Sergeant Bill and his cavalry friends had positioned themselves to cut off retreat. Within an hour, it was over. The last of Pete Morrison's men were either captured or fled so far they'd never returned to Colorado territory. Jim McKenna walked down from his cabin a free man, with his wife beside him, and justice finally served. But the biggest surprise was waiting in town. Doc Henley stood on the jail steps, very much alive and looking more sober than anyone had seen him in years. His dying confession had been an act, a desperate gamble to preserve his testimony and stay alive long enough to see justice done. Figured they'd try to kill me for sure once I started talking, Doc explained to the gathered crowd. So I played dead, hid in the old mine shaft, and waited for the real law to arrive. Marshall Henderson, a lean man with honest eyes and a federal badge that meant something, addressed the townspeople from the courthouse steps. Pete Morrison and Wade Briggs are both in federal custody, facing charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The territorial governor has appointed me to serve as acting marshal until proper elections can be held. Sarah stood beside Jim in the crowd, watching their neighbors' faces as the truth finally came to light. Some looked ashamed for believing the lies about Jim. Others seemed relieved that the shadow over their town was finally lifting. What about our mining claims? Called out a voice from the crowd. All fraudulent transfers are hereby void. Original claimants will have their rights restored. Henderson's voice carried the weight of federal authority. Anyone who lost property through Briggs' corruption can file for restitution. Jim's mining claim was officially returned to him, but Sarah noticed he didn't seem particularly interested in the paperwork. His attention was focused on her and on the future they could finally build together. But Pete Morrison wasn't finished yet. Even in federal custody, he made one last desperate play. As the marshals were loading him into the prison wagon, he broke free and lunged towards Sarah with a hidden knife, screaming about his property and what belonged to him. Jim moved faster than Sarah had ever seen a man move, placing himself between the blade and his wife. But it was Sarah who acted decisively, striking Pete with a heavy brass candlestick Mrs. O'Malley had given her as a wedding present. Pete Morrison crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally over. I was your property once, Sarah said, standing over his unconscious form. Now I'm my own woman, married to a man who sees me as a partner, not a possession. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Sarah barely heard them. She was focused on Jim, checking to make sure he hadn't been hurt in the scuffle. You saved my life, he said softly. Seems only fair, she replied. You saved mine first. Marshal Henderson approached them as Pete was loaded, now securely shackled, into the prison wagon. Mr. and Mrs. McKenna, the territorial government owes you a debt of gratitude. Your courage helped expose corruption that went all the way to the territorial capital. We just did what was right, Jim said simply. But as the excitement died down and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah noticed something troubling. She was swaying on her feet, her face flushed with fever. Sarah? Jim's voice seemed to come from very far away. The stress and exhaustion of the past few days finally caught up with her. She collapsed into her husband's arms, burning with fever from exposure and the infected scratch on her arm. Don't you dare leave me now, Mrs. McKenna, Jim whispered as he carried her toward the doctor's office. We've got a whole life to build together. Sarah's fever broke on the third morning, like a storm finally passing after days of thunder. Jim had kept vigil beside her bed without rest, reading aloud from his worn Bible, the same verses that had carried him through his darkest hours in that jail cell. When her eyes finally opened, clear and focused for the first time in 3 days, the relief that flooded his weathered face was so profound that even Doc Henley had to turn away and wipe his eyes. How long was I gone? Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but it was steady. 3 days and 2 nights. Thought I might lose you there for a spell. Jim's calloused hand found hers, thumb stroking across her knuckles with infinite gentleness. Fever had you talking to folks who weren't there, reliving things that happened years ago. Takes more than a little mountain fever to get rid of me, Jim McKenna. I'm counting on that, Mrs. McKenna. Word of Sarah's recovery spread through Silverton faster than wildfire in dry grass. The town that had once whispered about Devil Jim behind closed doors now rallied around the couple with the fervor of people making up for lost time. Mrs. O'Malley appeared with her largest pot of chicken soup and enough clean linens to outfit a hospital. Tommy and his father took shifts sitting with Jim so the exhausted man could finally rest his eyes. Most surprising of all, townspeople who had crossed the street to avoid Jim just weeks before now lined up outside Doc's office with offerings: fresh bread, preserved fruit, hand-knitted socks for the coming winter. Each visitor carried the same sheepish expression of folks who knew they'd been wrong and wanted to make amends without quite knowing how. Never seen anything like it, Doc observed, watching the parade of well-wishers from his window. Fear makes people do ugly things, but shame can make them do beautiful ones. When Sarah was finally strong enough to sit up and take notice of the world again, she and Jim faced the question that had been lurking beneath everything else. What came next? The mining claim that had started all their troubles was now officially restored to Jim's name. Along with compensation from the territorial government for his wrongful imprisonment, they had enough money to go anywhere in the country, start fresh where nobody knew their story. We could head to California, Jim suggested one afternoon as they sat on Doc's front porch sharing the sunshine and clean mountain air. Sacramento's growing fast. They need teachers there and the climate's easier on a body. Sarah watched the daily rhythm of Silverton play out before them. Children chased hoops down the main street while their mothers chatted over laundry lines. Honest merchants conducted their business without fear of corrupt officials demanding bribes. People who had been afraid to speak above a whisper for 2 years were finding their voices again, rebuilding the community bonds that corruption had severed. Or we could go back east, Jim continued. Boston maybe, or Philadelphia. You could teach in a real school again, with proper books and supplies. Sarah considered this seriously. The dream of teaching in a well-funded school with eager students and supportive parents had sustained her through many dark days. But as she watched Silverton healing itself, another possibility took shape in her mind. Or we could stay right here, she said finally. This town's been through hell, Jim. It needs good people to help it find its way back to decent. Jim studied her profile, seeing the determination that had first drawn him to her. You thinking about starting a school here? This valley's going to grow now that the corruption's gone. Mining claims will bring families and families bring children. Those children deserve better than ignorance and superstition. Sarah's voice strengthened as the idea took hold. They need education if they're going to build something better than what came before. Then that's what we'll do, Jim said without hesitation. Though I reckon we better make it official first. The decision to stay led naturally to planning their proper wedding. The jailhouse ceremony had been legal and binding, witnessed by God and Doc Henley, but Sarah yearned for something that celebrated their love rather than just their desperation. She wanted their union blessed by community and hope, not shadowed by bars and fear. The church wedding took place on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the promise of snow. The whole town turned out, filling every pew and spilling onto the street outside. Mrs. O'Malley served as matron of honor, resplendent in her finest dress and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had stood for right when it mattered. Tommy, scrubbed pink and wearing his father's best shirt, proudly bore the rings, matching gold bands that Jim had commissioned from the town's metalsmith, crafted from dust panned from his own claim. Doc Henley, sober for weeks now and dignified in a clean suit, performed the ceremony with words that carried the weight of struggle overcome. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice strong and clear, we gather today not just to witness a marriage, but to celebrate the triumph of truth over lies, love over fear, and hope over despair. These two souls have been tested by fire and proven true. They chose each other when the whole world seemed against them, and that choice has made us all better. When they exchanged vows this time, every word carried deeper meaning. They had moved beyond the desperate alliance of two lonely people to something richer and more enduring. I take you not in desperation, but in joy, Sarah said, her voice ringing clear as she slipped the gold band onto Jim's finger. Not because I need protection, but because I choose partnership with a man I respect and love. I promise to stand beside you in sunshine and storm, to build something good together, and to choose you every day for all my days. I take you not as rescue from loneliness, but as the completion of my heart, Jim replied, his usually quiet voice carrying to every corner of the church. Not as possession, but as the partner I want to face whatever comes alongside. I promise to cherish your strength, protect your dreams, and love you not just for who you are, but for who we become together. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by a community that had learned hard lessons about the difference between justice and revenge, between law and corruption, between the fear that divides and the respect that unites. At the reception in Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, Marshal Henderson made an announcement that surprised everyone, including Jim. The territorial government has authorized me to offer you the position of town sheriff when proper elections are held next spring, Henderson said, raising his voice over the celebration. Town needs someone who understands the difference between keeping the peace and keeping people afraid. Jim looked at Sarah, whose encouraging nod told him everything he needed to know. I'd be honored to serve, he said simply, and the room erupted in applause. As evening settled over Silverton like a blessing, Jim and Sarah walked home to the cabin they were building on the outskirts of town. Above their bedroom door, Jim had mounted his old cavalry saber, not as a weapon ready for use, but as a symbol of a chapter closed. "What's that for?" Sarah had asked when he first hung it there. "Reminder that my fighting days are over," Jim had replied. "Time to build instead of tear down." Now, months later, as Sarah stood in the doorway of her new schoolhouse watching children from across the valley arrive for their lessons, she placed her hand on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child was growing. Spring would bring new life in more ways than one. Jim appeared beside her, having finished his morning rounds as the newly elected sheriff. His badge was honest silver, earned through trust rather than taken through corruption. "Ready for another day of teaching?" he asked, placing a protective hand over hers on her growing belly. "Always ready to help folks learn something new," Sarah replied, leaning into his strength. "Speaking of which, what did you learn from that traveling preacher who came through yesterday?" Jim smiled, remembering the man's words about marriage being a daily choice to love rather than a legal contract to possess. "Learned that we chose right," he said simply. "Both times." As they walked into the schoolhouse together, teacher and sheriff, husband and wife, partners in building something better than what they'd found. The morning sun climbed over the mountains that had witnessed their struggle and now blessed their peace with golden light. Sometimes the most dangerous man in town is the one telling the truth. Sometimes the woman everyone calls desperate is the bravest soul you'll ever meet. Jim McKenna wasn't dangerous because he was violent. He was dangerous because he wouldn't bend his knee to liars and thieves. Sarah Beth didn't beg that mountain man to marry her because she was weak. She did it because she recognized something the whole town had missed. Real strength doesn't need to brag, real courage doesn't need an audience, and real love doesn't need fancy words. In a world full of people who'll sell their souls for comfort, there's something mighty powerful about two folks who'd rather face hell together than heaven alone. Jim and Sarah didn't just find each other. They found what all of us are looking for, someone who sees past the scars to the heart underneath. The town feared Jim because someone told them to. They dismissed Sarah because she seemed desperate. But fear and desperation can teach us something that comfort never will. They teach us who we really are when everything else gets stripped away. Maybe that's what real marriage is supposed to be, not just promising to love someone when they're easy to love, but choosing them when the whole world says you're a fool for it. Jim chose Sarah when she had nothing to offer but trouble. Sarah chose Jim when everyone said he was dangerous. Turns out they were both right to trust their hearts over other people's words. You know what strikes me most about their story? It wasn't the gunfights or the corrupt marshals or even the mountain siege that mattered most. It was the quiet moments. Jim sharing his meager meal with a stranger. Sarah tending his wounds with gentle hands. Two people choosing to see each other clearly when everyone else was blinded by lies and fear. In our world today, we're bombarded with noise, people telling us who to trust, who to fear, what to believe. But sometimes, in all that noise, we forget to listen to the quiet voice that knows the difference between a man's reputation and his character, between what someone says they are and what their actions prove them to be. Jim and Sarah's story reminds us that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're scared. Real love isn't the absence of struggle. It's choosing to struggle together rather than surrender separately. And real justice isn't about being popular or comfortable. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. If this story stirred something in your heart, maybe it's because you remember what it's like to be judged unfairly, or maybe you know what it feels like to stand alone for what's right. Either way, you understand why love like this is worth remembering. Stories like these remind us that in a world full of noise, the quiet voice of conscience still speaks the loudest. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to listen, you find exactly what you didn't know you were looking for. Share this story if it reminded you that real love and real courage never go out of style. In a time when it's easy to lose faith in human decency, we all need reminders that there are still people willing to choose what's right over what's easy and love over fear. Because at the end of the day, that's what makes all the difference.